This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least that's what most of these do. In this video, instead of looking at individual cards, I want to look at mechanics collectively. While I have already looked at best and worst mechanics, this video is a bit different. With Companion's recent dominance leading to a complete erratum for the ability, I thought it would be a good idea to look back at other mechanics that, for a time at least, dominated multiple formats. Companion definitely felt like a huge problem in the game, and that's why it had to be changed. In this video, I'm going to be looking at it and 9 other mechanics that have been problematic in multiple formats at once, and most of them had to be fixed by bans or restrictions. It will be interesting to see how Companion's multi-format dominance stacks up against the long history of the game. While this video is somewhat based on empirical data about tournament success, it's also somewhat subjective, as the actual order of the mechanics on the list is determined by a combination of how many formats a particular mechanic has found success in, and my own opinion about them. One last thing before this list. How did I define mechanic here? At their core, mechanics are abilities that appear on multiple Magic cards. This can include keyword abilities, but it can also include abilities that are not keyworded, like ability words. Though, as you'll see, most of the mechanics on this list have keywords. Alright, let's get started. At number 10, it's Cascade. On the face of it, Cascade is just a clearly powerful mechanic, as it generally gives you an additional card of value when you cast a card that has Cascade. And on top of that, countering the actual spell that has Cascade doesn't actually stop Cascade from happening, so it's pretty hard to ever come out ahead against a Cascade card because it's usually going to be giving your opponent or you a 2-for-1. Some of Cascade's multi-format dominance came courtesy of just using cards with it in a rather straightforward manner, like with Bloodbraid Elf or Shardless Agent, both of which give you a kind of inefficient creature, but they both make up for it in a huge way thanks to Cascade, which will always give you more than your mana's worth for either of them. Bloodbraid Elf has been a key card in Standard, Modern, Extended, and Legacy, and Shardless Agent has been played in Legacy as well. In addition to this straightforward way of utilizing Cascade, it's also been used to play insanely powerful spells that technically have a converted mana cost of 0, with Hypergenesis and Living End being the most famous. Decks could play several cards with Cascade and construct the deck in such a way that you always hit one of these powerful spells off of Cascade. Living End decks have found success in Extended and Modern, while Hypergenesis was played in Extended, at least until it was banned in the format in 2010. It's also banned in Modern ever since the format began in 2011. So Cascade has found success in just about every format, and it continues to some degree today, with decks running Bloodbraid Elf or Living End still very real factors in Modern. At number 9, I have Miracle. Miracle is a mechanic that allows you to cast spells when you draw them, and when you do that, you can play them for a much reduced cost. Basically, they are the ultimate thing in top decking. There are only 12 Miracles, and half of them have seen a considerable amount of play. Even if you're not really trying to abuse Miracle, Bonfire of the Damned and Terminus are just straight up powerful cards that get absolutely absurd when you cast them for their Miracle cost. And as a result, they've been played in several different formats. In addition to powerful miracles like the Bonfire and Terminus becoming staples in various formats, there are also decks entirely built around the mechanic. These found success in Innistrad Block Constructed, and most notably in Legacy, where Miracles continues to be a top-tier deck. These decks manipulate the top of their library in such a way that it isn't really much of a miracle when they rip one of them off the top of their library. This was most famously achieved in Legacy with Sensei's Divining Top, which ultimately had to be banned, at least in part because of the power of Miracle decks. At number 8, I have Affinity, in particular Affinity for Artifacts, a mechanic introduced in Mirrodin that reduced the cost of spells based on the number of artifacts in play. I think most people would have assumed this would be higher on the list, but the reason for that is because of deck naming conventions. Artifact decks in Modern today that we call Affinity don't really run, in many cases, a single card with Affinity, and some of them only run 1 or 2. But we still call that deck Affinity because its core dates back to the Affinity decks that we're about to talk about. Affinity's impact on Magic should not be overlooked. It dominated block, standard, and extended to the point that lots of cards had to be banned out of those formats to rein the deck in. Cards like Frogmite and Mirror Enforcer were frequently free spells in those decks, coming down in the extreme early game and really pressuring opponents before they could ever find their footing. While cards without the actual mechanic, like Arcbound Ravager, are a big reason for the success of Affinity decks, Affinity itself was a huge component of versions of the deck that had to get banned out of existence. As I mentioned, cards with Affinity are played in other formats too. In particular, Thoughtcast is played in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but it seems like a little bit of a stretch to say that card in particular is dominating the format, but the fact that a card with Affinity is being played in Magic's most powerful format does illustrate the power of the mechanic. At number 7, it's Threshold. So far, we've seen some mechanics that reduce the cost of things. Those types of mechanics often cause problems, but there's another type of mechanic that often ends up being powerful enough to dominate multiple formats. Mechanics that do stuff with the graveyard. In the case of Threshold, your card is better if you get 7 or more cards in your graveyard. That's not a big ask, especially in formats outside of block and standard. Threshold has only appeared as a mechanic within Odyssey block, and it's a mechanic that Magic R&D has since said will probably never return because it's too good. Decks entirely built around the mechanic have found success in block, extended, legacy, and to a lesser extent, vintage. The 2 Threshold cards that have been the most successful are Werebear and Nimble Mongoose. Both have been featured in block and extended, and Nimble Mongoose is one of the key cards in legacy and vintage Threshold decks. Both of these creatures give you insane efficiency if you can quickly load up your graveyard, with the Mongoose being a near unkillable 1-mana 3/3, and Werebear a 2-mana 4/4 who can ramp. In addition to those two being key in decks really built around the mechanic, there are several other cards with Threshold that have had significant success, with cards like Mystic Enforcer and Cephalid Colosseum finding considerable success in multiple formats. However, unlike most of the other mechanics on this list, no card in any format has ever been banned with the purpose of weakening Threshold decks. At number 6, it's Infect. This mechanic's strength comes from the fact that it essentially reduces the opponent's life to 10, since you only need to give them 10 poison counters to win the game, instead of doing 20 damage. Infect decks across multiple formats focus on rapidly making their Infect creatures huge, at which point they can win the game in a couple of swings. Infect decks have been hugely successful in Modern, but they've also been successful in every other format in the game, including Block, Standard, Extended, Legacy, and Vintage. Infect decks would have had even more success in Modern if it weren't for the banning of Blazing Shoal, which made it possible for Infect decks to win on turn 2 far too consistently. In Legacy, the main way of winning has been with Berserk, which could have a similar outcome to the Blazing Shoal plan. At number 5, it is Phyrexian Mana, another mechanic that reduces the cost of spells. Phyrexian Mana allows you to pay life instead of mana for each Phyrexian Mana symbol in a card's casting cost or activated ability. You can also pay mana of the card's color for the same effect. This makes cards considerably cheaper to cast, and Phyrexian Mana also made it so that any deck can run cards that cost Phyrexian Mana. This has led to cards like Dismember being utilized by decks that don't have access to very much removal because of their color. Dismember is a card that has been played in literally every format as a result, and at a pretty high level. It's a 1-mana instant that gives -5/-5 to a creature. It's hard to beat that level of efficiency. There's also Birthing Pod, a combo enabler so oppressive that it had to be banned out of Modern. While cards like Dismember and Birthing Pod have proven to be quite powerful, cards that are free if you pay life for them are probably the biggest problem, in particular Gitaxian Probe and Mental Misstep. Probe made decks too consistent and gives decks like Infect perfect information to proceed with their plans, and Mental Misstep gives any deck access to counter magic. Mental Misstep might seem narrow, but in many formats, especially the Eternal ones, it has been pretty oppressive thanks to a high concentration of cards with a converted mana cost of 1. The Misstep was ultimately banned in Modern, Extended, and Legacy, and restricted in Vintage. So many games came down to who had the most mental missteps, especially because you could counter opposing missteps with your missteps, and it was making games really uninteresting, especially because pretty much every deck was running 4. So yeah, making spells free and castable in literally any deck is a bad idea, and Phyrexian Mana became a key component in pretty much every format at some point as a result of that power. At number 4, I have Delve. I've already mentioned that mechanics that reduce the cost of things, as well as mechanics that use the graveyard as a resource, have been crazy good several times in the game's history, And with Delve, we have both in one mechanic. Cards like Gurmag Angler and Become Immense have found multi-format success appearing in decks that have no problem casting them for a single mana. While there are several cards with Delve that are highly efficient in non-rotating formats, the two cards that really made Delve into a dominant mechanic for a while were Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. These two cards had to be banned in Modern and Legacy and restricted in Vintage. In those formats that don't rotate, these two cards made Blue way too good, as it provided them with very easy and efficient card draw. While they weren't banned in Standard, they were still key cards in the format, appearing in many Blue decks. Cards with Delve are still played in every format they're legal in, but Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time were definitely the most powerful of the bunch. More recently, we had the printing of Hogak, who also made it way too easy to cast him, in a deck that was loaded up with ways to load the graveyard, like a mechanic we're going to see further up this list. But for now, let's move to number 3, which is Companion. Companion is a brand new mechanic from Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, and it turns out it was just way too good. Sure, these cards have certain requirements, but the upside is that you always have an 8th card in your opening hand, and it's the best card in your deck, and generally it also has special synergy with every single card in your deck. This has led to companion decks taking over a massive share of basically every single format, because why wouldn't you want an 8th card in every opening hand? And it sort of starts an arms race where everyone has to be playing companions to compete against other companions. While pretty much all of the companions have made some impact in some format, the two biggest offenders are probably Yorion and Lurrus. Lurrus is especially devastating in Legacy and Vintage, formats where meeting the requirement is way too easy, and his ability to help you recast powerful things from the graveyard can be really silly in those formats. Lurrus got banned in those formats as a result. Yorion has been having a big impact on Standard and Modern. Adding 20 cards to your deck really isn't a big deal, it turns out, especially when Yorion can come down and give you a ton of value while blinking your board and giving you a big flying win condition. In short, the companion mechanic was a complete debacle that quickly led to companion decks dominating every single format, and the speed with which it was accomplished, as well as the share of the metagame that companion occupied, was pretty impressive and even unprecedented. In fact, companion was such a problem that just this week they had to change how the mechanic works entirely. Now you have to pay 3 mana to put a companion from your sideboard into your hand before you can ever cast it. You can't cast it from your sideboard anymore, and that means Companion is going to get a little bit weaker, and for that reason I think we have to sort of push it back to number 3 on this list, because its dominance isn't probably going to be as long-lived as especially the number 1 or number 2 cards on this list, because theoretically and hopefully what they decided to do to Companion will nerf it in all the formats. At number 2, it's Dredge, another graveyard mechanic. Dredge makes it way too easy to load up your graveyard for various decks interested in using it as a resource, whether it's a threshold deck or a deck with delve spells or anything else. The mechanic didn't find a whole lot of success in Blocker Standard. There just weren't really many ways to abuse it. However, Dredge has been a key deck in Extended, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. The first time Dredge really came onto the scene as a powerful force was in Extended, where it was combined with Icarid. The deck's game plan is just to load up the graveyard and bring Icarids into play for free every turn and quickly kill the opponent. In a deck like that, it's possible to run very few or even no lands, making for a pretty weird-looking deck. It can also enable Reanimator decks with ease. The most notable cards with Dredge are probably Life from the Loam and Golgari Grave Troll. The Troll has Dredge 6, which allows him to load your graveyard in a hurry, and he could also serve as a win condition eventually, feeding off of all your dredged cards. He's been banned in Modern for most of the format's history. Life from the Loam can be used in conjunction with value lands for some pretty absurd value. It effectively draws you 3 cards every time you cast it, and you can dredge it back every turn, so that's pretty silly. It can also be combined with something like Seismic Assault to put your opponent on a quick clock. Dredge can do a lot of different things, and that has allowed it to be a dominant mechanic in multiple formats since the mid-2000s, and that's what allows it to edge out Companion for me. And at number 1, I have Storm, a mechanic so powerful that Mark Rosewater's scale of how likely it is we are to see specific mechanics return in the future is called the Storm scale, because Storm is a mechanic that we will never see in a standard release ever again due to its power. Storm decks have been dominant in all of Magic's formats at various times. These types of decks look to cast a bunch of spells in a turn and then cast a Grape Shot or Tendrils of Agony that takes the opponent out. This usually involves a bunch of free card draw and a bunch of ritual effects, not to mention usually casting stuff from your graveyard too, but it is a little bit too doable. Another famously good Storm card is Mind's Desire, which had to be preemptively restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy because it was too powerful in formats where it was easy to cast it on turn 3 or earlier with a huge Storm count, but Mind's Desire decks still found a home in Standard and Extended anyway. Storm decks are basically the ultimate combo deck, which are made extra powerful by the critical mass of good Storm cards and free or cheap card draw, because this lets you dig into your deck and find what you need while increasing your Storm count. While Companion may have made up a larger percentage of the field than Storm has consistently been a dominant deck in multiple formats since day one, and that type of consistency is worth more than what Companion or Dredge have done so far. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. Do you think there are any dominant mechanics I left out? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need some binge watching material, I've already done over 280 other MTG Top 10s, and you should see that playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.